Crabbe's Journal 20. I spent altogether 2 nights, 1.5 days, holed up, sleeping and thinking. When I finally came out, I found myself in a different world. Around me, the carved lines of great sweeping snowdrifts threw shadows across the snow, softening the bright morning light. Above, the sky was hard, clear blue, and the air was cold. The bush was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I suppose an artist would have been thrilled to death with the pattern of shadow and dazzling white and the brittle branches against the blue sky. But me, I just stood there calculating how I was going to handle the latest wrinkle in the saga of Crabbe the Traveler. Where I stood, right outside my nest, now shaped like an igloo, I was hip deep in snow, and God only knew what was waiting for me further on. One thing was sure, I'd have to abandon the canoe. But soon as I packed up again, slogging through the snow, it was hard going, I'll tell you. In places where the wind had got up some momentum during the storm, the snow was only knee deep. But I had to plow through drift after drift as I went along. Some deeper than my hips, I had to go around. Progress was very slow. By late afternoon, the sky was jammed up with low, ugly looking clouds that came on in a freshening wind, a wind that came head on against me. But I kept on, mostly out of frustration, in spite of the fading light and the unwelcome snow that began to sting my face. I repeated to myself, where in the hell is that lake? I figured the most I had to cover that day was 3, maybe 4 miles, yet here I was still slogging. Though I was certain I was on course, I checked the compass every few minutes and even hauled out the map to double check. Well, I was right. I reached the lake at nightfall. Completely exhausted, I leaned against the trunk of a thick maple as I looked out over the ice, for the lake had frozen during the blizzard for as far out as I could see. My legs felt rubbery, and I panted from an attack of hard packed drift that swept up against the shore in a huge curve. As my breath returned, so did my common sense. I had reached the lake, but so what? I was still miles from nowhere and landbound. In the rapid fading light, back to the wind, eyes squinted against the swirling snow, I checked the map. Ithaca Camp was the only place near, and it was a few miles northwest from where I was. Though probably closed for winter, it would at least have shelter. I quickly dug some food out of the pack, stuffing my mouth with jerky. As I chewed, I took a final check of my clothing. This last leg was going to be rough. I'd be traveling in the dark with no light, and no light would come from that snowy sky. The wind was stronger here, slamming against the trees, tossing the branches, which snapped and clashed in protest. The waving trunks groaned and squeaked eerily. I was wearing every article of clothing I owned, including the canvas pack coat, which was stiff frozen and crusted with ice and snow. My toque was yanked down across my brows and over my ears. My parka, inherited from Mary, was buttoned up tight, but I snugged the drawstrings of the hood a little bit more. Hood and toque were stiff rimmed with a frozen breath. My hands felt okay in the mitt socks, and my feet were only a little chilly. All systems go. I set out into the teeth of the wind without the pack. I couldn't carry the thing another step, so this trip was all or nothing. Why didn't I hole it up again as I should have? I'm not sure. Looking back, I think the reason was I felt so close. I was only a few miles from where I wanted to go, and I kept thinking just a little farther, just a couple more hours, and I'd be out of the cold. Which wasn't sensible at all, of course. A couple miles in a blizzard is a long, long way. I tried to stick to the shore of the lake because the land was fairly flat, and most of the drifts, though packed harder here, were only knee deep or so. But Mommy Nature always makes you pay. Out in the bush meant into the wind, which raced freely across the lake like a steel cold demon, snatching away my body heat as I stumbled along, eyes on either compass or the few feet of snow in front of me. It was dark now. There was snow in the wind, not much, but driven horizontally until the wind struck the trees on a rising shoreline and dropped its burden. I don't know how many times I fell before I lost my mitts. I fell forward in a deep drift, threw my arms out to break my fall. But the snow was deep, and I went in up to my shoulders, burying my face. I cursed and struggled in frustration, unable to push my way out because my arms just kept plunging into the snow, nothing to push against. Finally, I managed to roll sideways, only to find that my mitts were lost in the drift and impossible to find in the dark. Snow was jammed up to my sleeves, and I had a hell of a time digging it out. It wasn't long after that my hands, which I had tried to withdraw from the now snowy sleeves, developed a stinging sensation in them. The same sensation invaded my feet. Then it went away. I thought with relief I was beginning to warm up since the pain was gone. Then a horrible thought struck me, and I tried flexing my fingers. They were very stiff. Then my toes, same thing. I realized with a shudder that they hadn't warmed up. The pain went away because the tissue was beginning to freeze. I got really scared then and did something stupid. I began to run. But I didn't get very far before the sun before the run became a stagger and I fell again, gulping in big mouthfuls of frosty air. I was feeling cold all over now and didn't rise. I didn't want to. I sat in the snow, drew my knees up to my stomach, and tucked my chin into my collar. Maybe I'll just sit and rest a while, I thought. My breathing had become more regular. Boy, was I tired. I needed a rest. I began to feel very comfortable. The cold was going away, and I felt less afraid, and then not afraid at all, almost contented. Some people say reading is a waste of time, and maybe for them it is. But as I sat there watching tiny grains of snow dancing around the front of my face, I thought, this is just like a story I read by Jack London. Something about a fire. The guy in the story froze to death, but just before he drifted off, he lay down in a snowdrift, hallucinating, waiting happily to fall asleep. Well, I didn't think I wanted to go to sleep, at least not yet. But as soon as the image of that poor fool crossed my mind, I struggled quickly to my feet. Hell, I almost fell for it. I jammed my hands into my sleeves and pushed on, fighting the urge to run. It was an eternity. I remember telling myself, chanting, push, Crabbe, push, don't quit after this. I also remember praying, sort of, to Mary to help me just this one last time. It was right after I broke through the ice and crashed shin deep into water that was so cold it seemed to burn. I was so excited I shouted, I've made it, in words that were immediately whipped away by the wind. I knew now I was at the mouth of that shallow river that I'd floated down, the very start of my journey, the one with the sandbar. On I charged, exhilarated, breaking through ice all the way across the river and stumbling up the bank. In minutes, I reached a cabin that was luckily unlocked. With wooden hands, I clumsily unlatched and pushed open the door. It took ages to fetch my matches out of my pocket and to light one, since I could barely hold the box. In the dim light, I saw a coal oil stove, bunk, sink, dresser. With the help of a second match, I found a stub of a candle. The thin linoleum cracked with the cold as I worked to get the stove alight. In no time, the small cabin began to feel the effects of the stove. Then I stripped off my outer layer, letting it drop and stay where it fell. After drying my feet on a blanket, I dragged the bunk closer to the stove and climbed in. And I'm sure I smiled before I began to doze. But the smile didn't last long. Pain would not allow me to fall into sleep, burning pain in my hands, feet, and face. I knew that this was the frostbite withdrawing and that there was nothing to do but wait it out. I climbed. I climbed into the bunk after a few hours of half sleep and turned the stove down. The room was stifling by now, the windows fogged. It was daylight, past noon, by the look of the bright sun outside. Outside the cabin was frantically bright world of white. It hurt my eyes to look at it, and incredibly, melted snow dripped off the eaves of the cabin. I was still very weak, my legs shaky, and my head light. It hurt to walk, but I was parched, so I found some old enameled pots under the sink and set about melting snow. I drank and drank, coughing all the time. The warm liquid set me off. My chest hurt deep down. I lay on the cot again, soaking in the warmth, the beautiful warmth. I could almost touch it. I continued to doze. By the end of the day, my face and feet were okay. My right hand was a bit better, too, a bit stiff, but clearly fine. My left hand was in deep trouble, though. The pinky and ring fingers were swollen up like ugly yellow-brown sausages, and the skin had begun to split. Anything that touched them set off ragged waves of pain throughout the hand and up to my arm. When I made tea, dusty brown stuff I found on a shelf, and hung my clothes by the stove, it was nip and tuck, one-handed fumbling. The other thing that worried me was my chest. It was still sore and hurt like hell when I coughed. The next morning, I pulled on my clothes and shut off the stove. Since I had no mitts, I tore strips from off the wool blankets and wrapped my hands, clumsily, but all right. The left I wrapped especially carefully until it looked like I was carrying a huge red club. It was tough going to the main road. The snow was wetter than the warmer weather and hard to slug through. I began to hitchhike and saw my first car pretty soon. It swooshed past, throwing up a great cloud of snow. Shortly after, a bright, clean pickup stopped for me. The driver had to lean across and open the cab door for me as I fumbled on the outside handle with my blanketed hand. With difficulty, I clambered up and shut the door. Gotta put your seatbelt on before I take off, said the driver. He was a big, heavy guy dressed in a red-green checkered bush shirt, denim overalls, and a wool hunting cap. He was friendly-looking, with fat cheeks and W.C. Fields' nose. It seemed strange to hear a voice, the only human, other than Mary, that I'd heard in months. I struggled with the seatbelt buckle for a time, and he leaned over to help after slamming the gear shift lever into park. Some blizzard, eh? He said as he drove off. Heard on the news this morning was the worst in 20 years. Yeah, I answered, pretty bad. We got the roads plowed, though. Worked all last night. I drive a plow. Oh, I said. He kept looking at me. Something wrong with your hand? Yeah, frozen, I think, I said, trying not to sound dramatic. Better have a look, he said, as he pulled the truck over to the roadside. Don't want to fool around with frozen fingers. I couldn't unwrap it, so he did. Jesus Christ, he exclaimed when he saw the two yellowy fingers. What happened? That's bad. His eyes were bugging out of his face. Before I could answer, he said excitedly, We gotta get you to a doctor. He rammed the truck into gear and tore away, fishtailing on a slippery road. Soon we were speeding along, slipping and sliding. I had visions of being wrapped around a tree in a metal envelope or buried forever in huge banks of snow that lined the road. Don't worry, my good Samaritan almost shouted. You'll be okay. I didn't feel okay. I was coughing like mad. Every cough a sharp jab, but he was the only excited person in that pickup. He reached over his head and flipped a switch, then unclipped a mic. He said he said a stream of stuff into the thing, and I couldn't understand the weird mixture of words and numbers. I recognized 10-4 from TV shows, though. I wondered if he was really serious when he called the doctor a sawbones. We ripped into town at a furious pace, ran a red light, barreled past a big stone church, and pulled around another corner. Slid is a proper word. And onto the side street, lined with spruce, and stopped in front of a big rambling frame house with a wide veranda. The signs hung over the door. My chauffeur jumped out, slammed the door, and ran up the steps. He came back, hiked his portly body into the cab, made a skidding U-turn, and got back on the CB as we tore through down. Hanging up the mic, he exclaimed that the doc was at the clinic about 100 miles south in Huntington. That's where we were going. Don't worry, kid, I'll get you there, he added, confidently in a kind voice. Don't hurry on my account, I said weakly, hoping to slow this headlong flight. Gotta make tracks, he answered. Can't fool around with frozen fingers. We were on the highway now, and the motion made me drowsy. I dozed a little. I awoke to find myself being carried by that hulking character through sliding glass doors and down a long hall. I was so weak I didn't protest. I looked into his round face. The guy looked really concerned. About a stranger. He took me into a big room and laid me on a table. Thanks, I murmured, as he stepped out of sight. 3 women in white stood around me, and one began to unwrap my hand. One gave orders in a quiet voice. When my hand was unwrapped, they all went silent, but only for a minute. Then I felt a needle.